to introduce Dana Carroll. She got her bachelor's at the Ohio State in molecular genetics, and then she went ahead and got a PhD in epidemiology. She came to do a postdoc here at the University of Minnesota with me, and what really attracted me to her is the fact that she was very interested in health disparities. And I think this interest grew out of a analysis of the state survey in Oklahoma that showed there was a high incidence of cancer among the American Indian population. And this really drove her to wanting to know what was the reason for this. And part of it was the fact that they also have a high prevalence of smoking. So she did her dissertation and looking at biomarkers of exposure among the American Indian tribe that she was looking at, and for both e-cigarettes and cigarettes, and also looking at nicotine metabolite ratio in the American Indian population. And in part, the reason why you want to take a look at nicotine metabolite ratio is because there are people that metabolize nicotine faster than others, and those who do metabolize nicotine faster tend to be more dependent and also have more difficulty with cessation. So she came with that background, and at that time we were having a memorandum, or created a memorandum of agreement with one of the tribes here in Minnesota. And so it was just kind of an ideal fit for her to be working with us. And she took the bull by the horns and really and has completed a project with this particular tribe, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit about her experiences that she had conducting research with this tribe. So she's done a remarkable amount of work, not only among the American Indian population, but she also is now a co-investigator on a couple projects that has to do with trying to make cigarettes less addictive, less appealing, and less toxic. In her hobby, in her free time, I guess, she has organized a pre-conference, which is really great, on women in science in tobacco control. And she also has written an article about the divisiveness right now in tobacco control on the whole issue of harm reduction, particularly e-cigarettes, whether it's beneficial or whether it's harmful to society, and how that divisiveness in our tobacco control science has really affected trainees and younger faculty. So she does a lot of different things. So I'm really delighted to introduce Dana. She currently is an assistant professor in the School of Public Health, Division of Health, Environmental Health Sciences. So Dana.
Thanks, Dorothy, for that introduction. I wish I could get a little snippet of that for anyone that wants to know about me. So again, my name is Dana Carroll, and today I'm going to be talking to folks about some of my recent work. And I hope to accomplish two things. One, to potentially motivate you guys to think about how you can become involved or lead some community-based efforts. And then also to use this time to showcase some of my work and what I do in the communities. So just a brief overview of today's presentation. I'm going to give some definition and motivation for community-based participatory research. And then I'm basically going to go into what led me to working with some of the American Indian communities in Minnesota, as well as my prior work in Oklahoma. And I'll share some lessons learned with you guys today. So I wanted to start off with asking everyone, and you can just think to yourself, why community-based research? What value does it have? You can take a second to think about this. So for me, I view it as a social justice issue. It is a means to provide equal access to health and research. It allows the community who has the expertise and perhaps the cultural knowledge to be the major players in achieving solutions to their health problems. With the Masonic Cancer Center, we're located here in the Twin Cities, but our catchment area is greater Minnesota, as well as some of the bordering states. And so if we don't venture out of what this little picture shows here in Ivory Tower, we are neglecting the communities that are likely in need of partnership. with us. So here are some definitions of community-based participatory research that I really liked. This one says, a collaborative approach to research that equitably, and that's an important word, involves all partners in the research and recognizes the unique strengths that each brings. So there are many communities, for example, the American Indian community, the African American community, and others that have a history of oppression and power imbalance. In a community-based participatory research approach, it centers on equal partnership. The academic and the community are equal players in the research process. Another definition that I really like actually comes from our University of Minnesota Program in Health Disparities Research website. And this says, requires the unification of the academic researcher and the community. Within this partnership, the community members serve as active and equal partnerships throughout the entirety of a given project. So again, really emphasizing the equal partnerships. And this is one that I've come to like just based on some of my experiences. Community-based participatory research best honors the cultural knowledge and expertise of the community and empowers the community to be the major player in solving their own health problems. So I just wanted to briefly mention some of the elements or principles of community-based participatory research. It is centered on the fact that community is a unit of identity. And the premise is this, is that in order to have solutions to a public health problem, that we need to get to know the community, we need to learn about their history and their culture at a deep level to really learn how we can partner and be most impactful. It also sets on a cooperative and co-learning process. And so this has become really vital in a lot of my relationships with American Indian tribes. So a bi-directional learning process. So the community educating the researcher on their history, their culture, why this is a health problem that they want to combat. And then the researcher or the research team can provide education to the community around their area of expertise and how a potential research path can lead to a benefit to the community. What is also integral in a community-based participatory research process is long-term commitment and sustainable commitment. So many of us here at the university, you may write a grant, hopefully you get funded, and the next day you can start writing or start conducting the study. In community-based participatory research, there is often a time at which you need to get to know the community, develop trust, develop respect with one another, and that can take several years. And so a long-term commitment is crucial. This process also has a balance of research and action. So providing the community with, although the research process and discovering knowledge is important, how can our results benefit the community? How can they be used to impact their members? And other ways, other avenues of action, such as education, building capacity in the community, for example. And all of these principles, what is required is trust and respect. So developing the trust with the community and respecting their culture and their history. So that's just a little bit of some motivation, hopefully, to partake in this type of research. And now what I'm going to do is walk you through some of my experiences. And so I have had experience working with, and the honor to work with several American Indian communities. And American Indian and Alaska Native is a term to describe a population that is actually a heterogeneous group of tribes. And so there are many different cultures within the American Indian community. And actually at present state, there is an estimated 2 million American Indians in the United States. And by 2050, it's estimated that this number will double to around 4 million. So this population is growing faster than any other race group. So as Dorothy nicely summarized, my work in this area started when I was out in Oklahoma. So I was at the Stevenson Cancer Center as a trainee epidemiologist, and I was tasked at looking at lung cancer incidence rates. So many folks in this room may know that lung cancer, about 90% of the cases are due to cigarette smoking or secondhand smoke exposure. And so if we look at lung cancer trends, after taking in a sufficient lag period, we can see if there's been progress made in tobacco control and prevention work efforts. And so this graph is basically looking at lung cancer incidence change over time in the overall population in Oklahoma, as well as males and by age groups. And the bar graphs are all decreasing, suggesting or showing that the lung cancer incidence rates were indeed declining in the state of Oklahoma, which was good to see. My next question, though, was this the case across race groups? And so just to orient you, because I know it's small, the dashed line is lung cancer incidence rates in American Indians, and the 2 lines below are whites or African Americans. And so we saw that on average each year that whites and African Americans were declining in lung cancer incidence, but that was not the case for American Indians. So we knew that American Indians had high rates of lung cancer, but what we were hoping to see is that they were declining, and that was not the case. And actually, we were also seeing that American Indian females had an increase in lung cancer rates. And so this really led me, I remember sitting in my cubicle and thinking, wow, how can I best provide my expertise to these communities in a way that can help combat their rates of lung cancer incidence. And so as I mentioned, the primary risk factor for lung cancer is commercial tobacco use. And what we do see, and this is a recent paper I published looking nationally across different race groups in the United States, and American Indians indeed have significantly higher prevalences of commercial tobacco use. And I underline commercial for an important distinction within the American Indian community. So commercial tobacco is what we think of that is pushed on us by the big tobacco industry. Cigarettes are altered with ingredients. They contain more than 7,000 chemicals. 70 at least are known carcinogens, and that's what the Masonic Cancer Center researchers has done a lot of work contributing to that evidence base. They are addictive. They are sold for profit. This is in comparison to the use of traditional tobacco among many, but not all tribes. And so for centuries, for the history of American Indians, tobacco has had a sacred role and is often used in prayer and ceremony to give as offerings. It's not always smoked. Often it is what is considered to put it out as an offering to the creator, but it can be in a ceremony setting, smoked out of a pipe, but not inhaled often. And it's important to know that this use does vary across tribes. Some tribes don't have this history. And because of this important distinction, what we've actually seen is that if tobacco control efforts make statements such as be tobacco free, this can be quite offensive to many American Indian tribes who have a rich and long history of traditional tobacco use. And for this reason, you see here an ad that was a campaign done by Clearway, Minnesota over the past 5 to 10 years that was value our tradition, keep tobacco sacred. And this is a paper that was published recently that also drew attention to this. Why the world will never be tobacco free, reframing tobacco control in a traditional tobacco movement. And actually there's some really interesting data showing that American Indians that do engage in traditional tobacco use, it's protective against commercial tobacco use. And what is the information there is that it is helping to restore how tobacco should be used versus how tobacco should not be used. So this is, if you're an epidemiologist, what we often refer to as the kind of epidemiologic triad. And for me, it just helps orient me to some of the different areas that I can provide expertise to some of the tribes that I work with. And so we have the vector, which is the tobacco industry that pushes tobacco onto our communities. And there's been explicit direct targeting of American Indians. There's the agent, which is the tobacco products themselves that are addictive. There are host characteristics such as genetics, social demographics, lifestyle, and as well as numerous environmental factors, including access, the regulatory environment in which tobacco exists in, and particularly culture and social norms, and history of oppression, for example, that are specific to the American Indian population. And so one area when I was in Oklahoma that I wanted to look at is well, what are the potential relative harms of different tobacco products? And At this time, it was, there were some American Indian community members saying, while there have been studies in other race groups, we want to see data among our own people. Even if it's no different than other race groups, we want to see the data among our own people. And so around this time is when e-cigarettes were really launching onto the marketplace. And again, the community wanted to know what were the relative exposures in e-cigarettes compared to cigarettes, because a lot of folks were interested in whether or not they could reduce their exposure if they switched to e-cigarettes. And there was also a question of dual use. And so we see many e-cigarette users are also still smokers. And so are dual users reducing their exposure, or are they no different actually than cigarette smokers? And so this was a small pilot feasibility study that I did alongside the urban American Indian community in Oklahoma. And again, we were really interested in looking at biomarkers of exposure and users of these different classes. And biomarkers are powerful tools to understand an objective understanding of dose regarding tobacco product use in the users themselves compared to self-report data. And so this study involved numerous in-person meetings in the Oklahoma City area with tribal health and leadership boards. I also met with elders to discuss the study and the study protocol. But looking back on it, it was not necessarily an equal partnership. This is what I really view as a community. It was community-based, it was community engaged, but not community-based participatory research. And so one of the things, as I mentioned, I was really interested in the establishing feasibility. Can we recruit participants for a study that looks at biomarkers of exposure, knowing that the history of American Indians in research, there has been a great deal of maltreatment, and would they be willing to participate in a study that involved biological samples? And so what we did is that I ventured out to a lot of community events. There I am at a community health fair. And on your left or your right, I was actually set up at a vape shop in a predominant American Indian community. And so going out into the community, which seemed quite obvious, it was really an efficient way to recruit. It allowed for me to show my face, to build the trust, you know, who is behind this research study. And so it resulted in us achieving the sample size numbers. And so just to discuss one set of results, again, we were interested in looking at the relative exposure in e-cigarette users versus only smokers versus dual users. And so the first graph is looking at total nicotine equivalents. And so nicotine is the addictive chemical in these tobacco products. And what we did see is that, again, we had some small sample sizes, about 30 per group, but what it did appear to look like is that e-cigarette users were getting similar levels of nicotine as cigarette smokers and dual users. So if you think about a product that can help smokers that are unwilling or unable to quit with existing, for example, FDA-approved smoking cessation treatment, you would want a product that potentially can provide similar levels of nicotine but less exposure to harmful constituents. So we did observe similar levels of nicotine. And then we also looked at carbon monoxide, which is a cardiovascular toxicant, and total NNL, which is a potent lung carcinogen, a biomarker for a potent lung carcinogen. And what we did see is that e-cigarette users had significantly lower levels than smokers. What we also saw was that dual users did not really differ from smokers. So basically, dual users were not reducing their exposure, but we did see some benefit in e-cigarette users. And so what I then used these results to educate the community, and I also presented at scientific meetings that for smokers unwilling or unable to quit, an e-cigarette might be a viable option, but we should really discourage dual use, and essentially cessation of all tobacco products is the end goal. And again, this was in line with the other literature, but for the American Indian community, they really wanted to see data among their own people. So this was how I finished up my time in Oklahoma, and then I came up to Minnesota, which, as many know, the weather is very different here, and so I'm still adjusting, but I am enjoying Minnesota. So just to bring this home a little bit with some Minnesota data. So indeed, we still, we see in Minnesota some striking disparities in smoking in the American Indian population. And in fact, because the general population smoking prevalence is low compared to many other states, our disparities are even more stark here. And so there are some tribes in which as many as 2 out of 3 adults are current smokers. So they're smoking either every day or some days. And so that is very high compared to the general population. And in line with that is we also see disparities in lung cancer. So just to orient you really quickly to this graph, here's American Indian statewide. Blue is males, the gray is females, and here's the non-Hispanic white group. So our disparities in lung cancer mirror the smoking prevalences in that they're much higher in American Indians than whites. So as Dorothy mentioned, around this time, it was really a great time to come to Minnesota because there was a tribal university collaboration that was just starting. And they were discussing different ways. And so the tribe was very concerned about smoking and lung cancer. And our partnership was discussing different ways and avenues of research that would be beneficial to the community. And I really like this picture because what it shows is there's different people sitting around a table, and we all have a puzzle piece that can contribute to the puzzle. So we all have an expertise, whether that be on the community or the culture or in research. And so with the tribe, we did discuss several avenues of research, and there were multiple projects proposed. And one that was seen as really promising by the tribe and also utilized our expertise was to look at nicotine metabolism. And I'll provide some rationale for why we decided to go down that route. But for the tribe, one of the things was they, of course, wanted to better understand their smoking, why such a high smoking prevalence and lung cancer disparity. But they also were starting to hear the terminology precision medicine, as we all have in the more recent years, and wanting to partake in research, genetic research, that could help them be on the forefront of some of these personalized approaches that were emerging. And why this is really important with some of our communities is that if you think about those folks that have access to health and research and these personalized techniques, they're likely the folks that are not in the health disparity populations. They have access, they might be very close to the university, they can enroll in these clinical trials or enroll in this research. And so we were concerned, and as the tribe as well, that while many evidence-based practices exist, they have yet to be explored or tested in American Indian communities. And so making sure they were on the forefront of genetic research was an important component. So just to highlight, this is where we're at in some of the host factors, and that was what the tribe was interested in looking at. So just briefly, why nicotine metabolism? So nicotine is metabolized predominantly to cotinine, and then from there 3-hydroxylcotinine by an enzyme CYP2A6. And this enzyme is encoded by a gene, CYP2A6, that is quite polymorphic. It has many variants, and folks can have no function in this gene. So this process is actually, they don't metabolize nicotine very well, or they can be normal or fast metabolizers. And so in that case, the pathway is going very fast. And so for someone who's a faster or normal metabolizer, they're going to have more 3-hydroxylcotinine than cotinine in their system. And so they will have a higher ratio of nicotine metabolism. So one of the nice areas that we thought a plus about this research as well, we could look at the genotype, but there's also a phenotype, this nicotine metabolism ratio, that we can use to study as well. And as I mentioned, we had expertise in this area, and there's several folks in here, Sharon Murphy, who's really pioneered this area. And so what we were showing in a recent publication using an epidemiologic study, as well as some of Dorothy's data from some baseline clinical trial data, and this was among whites. And so what we saw is that with a faster or normal nicotine metabolism rate, cigarettes per day, and they were also getting greater levels of that nicotine dose than those that are slow metabolizers. We also showed that because of that, as one would expect, you get nicotine, and then with nicotine is all the harmful constituents. That the normal or fast metabolizers had higher levels of a biomarker for a lung carcinogen, total NNL, as well as biomarkers for volatile organic compounds. So overall, greater carcinogen and toxicant exposure. And here I'm just showing you a couple of our data points, but there were several other biomarkers that we also looked at. And what was novel for this paper that we just recently published in Cancer, or it's in press in Cancer Epidemiology, Biomarkers and Prevention, is that we also saw higher levels of biomarkers of effect. So this include inflammation and oxidative stress. And those are integral in the disease process from smoking to development of, for example, lung cancer. And so you can see how this bundles up individuals for higher smoking, more heavier smoking, as well as higher lung cancer risk. And this was done, this study in whites, but we see that there's racial differences in nicotine metabolism. And so what we hypothesized with the tribe was that perhaps the American Indian tribal members were faster nicotine metabolizers, and that was contributing to their higher rates of lung cancer. Another really interesting avenue with this research was that it has been used to inform treatment, so to personalize smoking cessation treatment. So again, we wanted to go down this avenue because the tribe's request to participate in personalized techniques and personalized medicine. So just a little bit of background about that. So a clinical trial in 2016 showed that based on whether or not you're a slow or a normal fast metabolizer, the question was, do you respond better to varenicline, which that's actually the most effective smoking cessation treatment, or perhaps some of these differences might make you respond better to nicotine patch. And so just to orient you to this graph, here are the slow metabolizers. And so there was no significant difference between varenicline or patch, which was interesting because again, varenicline is shown to be most effective in the general population when non-tailored. But what was also really interesting about this and helpful to know was that the nicotine patch resulted in lower side effects than varenicline. So if a patient comes in, there's no difference in efficacy, but the side effects are lower, one would likely recommend the treatment option that has lower side effects. So the authors recommended nicotine patch for slow metabolizers. Whereas for normal or fast metabolizers, you do see a significantly higher percent quit on varenicline, and the side effects were no different. So if there was a fast metabolizer, you would want to recommend varenicline potentially. And those were also observed at 6 months follow-up, which was promising. And so this created this framework, and what is suggested in the near future perhaps is that a smoker in a clinic can be prescribed a treatment option based on a nicotine metabolism that will set them up for the best success. And there's actually a nicotine metabolism ratio test, rapid test kit, I believe, under development with the FDA. So there's real world application for this hopefully soon. And so the tribe was really interested in this. So one, can we look at nicotine metabolism to understand smoking behavior and lung cancer risk? But then can we use this data to inform our future smoking cessation works? So it was a really nice pilot research study to do with the tribe. And so for the study that we just wrapped up, the main goal was to look at the nicotine metabolism via genotype and phenotype, and then to also look at biomarkers of nicotine and carcinogen exposure. We also were interested in looking at tobacco-specific DNA abducts, and then as well as looking at potential risk factors that were not genetic related, because we know that that's likely a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole puzzle. And so we wanted to make sure that, again, this would have a balance of research and action for the tribe. And so one, this type of research would help contribute to understanding some of the mechanisms going on underlying their health disparities. We foresee that our results, and we're in this process now of analyzing the results, that we can use to educate the tribe on their risk for disease, and they would have their own data. One thing that I really am starting to lean more into and realize is that this is creating a culture of research at the tribe. So this one study hopefully will have some really impactful results. But if that's not the case, we will still be contributing to a research environment and providing them with opportunities, and this might give way to more studies. Of course, we thought that this could help inform smoking cessation efforts down the road. And again, the tribe would be put on the forefront of genetic research and applications. So I just want to mention the type of data collected because this is a really exciting and a study with this tribe. So of course we had some survey data, self-report, but then we also had biological samples. And so we collected urine samples, saliva samples, and some oral cell swabs. And I mention this because one of the important things is that the tribe owned their own data and that they were able to store it at the tribe. And so I'll discuss one of the lessons learned is to, when building the research capacity, to ensuring that you honor the tribe's wishes, and that was that they would store the samples on their reservation. So just to go over some of the recommendations based on lessons learned. Invest in relationships. So relationships. Think about everything you do in your day-to-day life. It's likely built around a partnership, someone you collaborate with, a relationship that you have. And so this type of approach requires ample time into getting to knowing the community's culture, their history of research, and the academic, as well as the academic partners. It's important that the partners listen, ask questions, be flexible, and act respectfully. And so one of the things with being flexible is recognizing that while here at the university we might have dedicated time to research, that is likely not the case for the tribe or the community you're working with. They will probably have many priorities, they wear many hats and spread quite thin as it is. And so while the research is a priority and a need, being and honoring the fact that if you hope to get a reply or to hear back that day, it might be a week or so. So being flexible. And it's also important to communicate those expectations. So what I learned in moving forward is to have, to understand what expectations are. So what do you see your timeline is? When would you like us to submit for funding? Where, do you prefer communicating via email, over the phone? Would you prefer us to be up in person to really be making these decisions? And so getting that information is really key. And I know or at least I was told, the Program in Health Disparities Research has a nice toolkit on their website that community academic partners can use when they're at the start of their partnership, but throughout, to keep it updated, to understand different ways of communication and timelines. And then, of course, you want to be sure that it's an equal partnership so that you're engaging the community representatives in all decisions that are made for the study. And so in a lot of communities, this might involve a community advisory board, like a CAB. And we did have although we never referred to it as that, we had several of the healthcare professionals at the clinic involved in ensuring that the study and all the procedures were done in a way that was culturally sensitive and that they were on board with all of our procedures and approaches to the research. I mentioned this already, so communicate expectations and roles. Another thing is to determine who's responsible for different aspects of the study. So who's the chain of command? So for example, if all of a sudden a really exciting grant opportunity comes up, what is the process for applying to that? Do you need to have it's likely that you'll need to have a proposal, get feedback from the community that you're working with, but who would be that person? And with that as well, so if there's often a deadline for an abstract or a grant, I will pencil back almost at least 2 to 3 weeks to make sure that the tribe has had proper time to review, ask questions. Perhaps I need to go up to discuss with them any concerns or suggestions that they may have. Another lesson learned recommendation is to develop a Memorandum of Understanding, so an MOU. So this serves as a contract between the academic and community partners. It's a really nice way to write out what the study will look like, who the chain of command is, what are our expectations. And so it's a nice way to have a written document to know that both of you will have seen it, that everyone is on board with what is being proposed. Because you might have a study idea in your mind until you write it down. How do you know that the other, your partner is in agreement unless they are able to see exactly what you're planning? It should be updated as well. A memorandum of understanding is not something that you do and then you collect dust on it and never revisit it. It should be updated as the partnership evolves. Maybe there's new leadership involved. Perhaps the study takes a different route. So this should be updated so that all parties are aware of any changes. And details included in the Memorandum of Understanding should be leadership roles, project goals, and timeline. And an important piece is a data sharing agreement. And so to elaborate a little bit on a data sharing agreement, this is a agreement, and so could be bullets or a few pages that explicitly addresses how the data and samples will be stored, analyzed, shared, disseminated, and destroyed. So this is really important because it will provide, for example, in the tribe, they wanted to store the samples on tribal land, and we wanted to make sure that was honored, and they were provided with the capacity to do that. And so knowing that, we then bought them a freezer to do so. Also, who can have access to the samples? If there's another investigator that wants to contribute to the research, can that be an option? How will the results be disseminated? Simple things, is it okay, obviously researchers have scientific journals that they are expected to publish in, discussing those and what that would look like, as well as can the tribe or the community be mentioned? And so this all can be included in the MOU. Also, another lesson learned, and as I've alluded to already, is to provide the community with resources to support the study and how they want to store, for example, samples. So the goal here again is what we're trying to do is create empowering the community to be the major player in the research process. And so providing them with the capacity to do that. So that might look like a freezer. It could look like even a locked cabinet for storing consent forms. And so this is an important component of the relationship building. Another key component is to hire a community member. And so there's multiple reasons to do this. And this was the community member, Carroll, who just ran the study. And she was just such an amazing and fantastic person. And I really have learned so much from her. And so they are a community expert. They will know the community. They will know the culture. Potentially, participants will feel more comfortable talking to someone from their own community. Oftentimes, we ran into some interesting recruitment. We weren't making our recruitment goals. And she said, well, this is occurring this week. It's likely that recruitment will be back and running next week, or situations like that. And also, she was able to recommend avenues of recruitment that we might have not thought about. And so she was really helpful in that. And then also, one of the things was, especially for communities that are hours away from where we are at, there's a barrier there with traveling and time. And so when actually we first started this study, I would drive up almost every other week to recruit participants at the clinic, at the tribal clinic. And so like with our participants here in the cities, it's a similar situation where they will not show up, they will cancel last minute, things come up, and you'll reschedule them for the next day. But I wasn't up there the next day. And so this was caused some difficulty with recruitment. And so the Masonic Minnesota Cancer Clinical Trials Network provided some really wonderful funds to help us support our research coordinator. And of course, she came from the community and helped alleviate that barrier. Also throughout, and I think I've mentioned this, is the need to get to know the culture. So there is a word I actually just recently got to know, and it's cultural attunement. And this word comes from Dr. Linda Frizzell within the School of Public Health, and she teaches the American Indian minor here at the university. And so cultural attunement is a term that has evolved to represent something more active or sensitive than cultural competency. And it's a lifelong pursuit. So I think if we envision cultural competency, while that's not wrong, it almost assumes that at some point we know the culture. It often relies on perhaps being educated about the culture, But cultural attunement is experience with the culture, and it requires a lot of your reflecting on yourself. How am I viewing the culture? And it's a lifelong process, and it gets much more than the surface level. It gets deep into the culture. And I like the term attunement because it almost sounds, when you think like you tune a piano, sometimes it can get out of tune. And so along your process, getting back in tune with the community. And in line with that is making sure that anything that you do, including any study procedures or instruments, are culturally appropriate. So one way to do that is to get the community advisory board their feedback on all of the instruments and procedures used. One thing that we noticed early on, just as an example, is we have a tobacco use history survey that we use in the tobacco research programs, and we never differentiate between commercial versus traditional tobacco. And so what we learned, if someone's within the American Indian community starts partaking in that survey, it could be very confusing. And so clarifying those terminologies. Again, as I've mentioned, it's important to strike a balance between the scientific process and creating action and benefiting the community. So the exciting thing about our research question and area with nicotine metabolism is the potential not only to educate the community on the findings using their own data, but that it could lead to a smoking cessation trial in the future one day, and that could benefit the community. Also building the capacity in the community, hiring a community member, for example, providing them with the resources are all ways to create action within the community. And just to wrap up, I wanted to touch on briefly a couple other exciting and ongoing studies that I have that fall within some of the environment, but also the host realm of this triad. So I am just starting a collaboration, and we're applying for some pilot funding to develop a traditional tobacco use toolkit for promoting commercial smoking cessation. So as I mentioned, there have been some studies showing that if one practices traditional tobacco use, it's protective and helps reduce commercial tobacco use. So we're interested in restoring tobacco with how it is supposed to be used in the traditional lens with a tribe. And the goal is that it's almost would be viewed as a add-on to an existing smoking cessation program, and potentially it could have an opportunity to be adapted so that other tribes can use it as well. And then I'm also entering an exciting partnership with Michael Mudgett, who is the research manager at the American Indian Cancer Foundation. And we're starting to explore how we can deliver culturally tailored smoking cessation interventions through mobile health to reach this population, because there are often tribes that don't have access to culturally tailored interventions due to lack of resources, but also many members of these communities live in rural settings and they lack access. So this could be a promising area as well. And so just to wrap up, of course, I'm here today, but all of this work has been an equal partnership with the tribal collaborators and community members. I wished I had invited Carroll down, our research coordinator, but I think in the near future what we're going to try and do is have a similar presentation where she speaks from her perspective of the community, and then I can also speak from my perspective as the researcher. And I want to also thank my U of M collaborators, of course, Dorothy, and the most recent study came out of the Minnesota Precision Medicine Collaborative, and so Abby, Pam, and Aaron helped spearhead that. Of course, the Minnesota Cancer Clinical Trials Network, they provided resources so that the tribe had the capacity to conduct the study, and then my efforts in Oklahoma and my collaborators there. And so that's all I have for you today, and I'm welcome to take any questions.
Let me get you the microphone.
So you're going to try to develop a mobile app, which is mostly concentrated on developing behavioral and psychosocial skills, right?
So how are you going to integrate that with some of the current research that you're doing, looking at slow and fast metabolism?
Yeah, it's a good question, Dorothy. It's kind of a question since I'm an early career investigator trying to keep a vision of where my research is going. And so I really see, so mobile health is actually being looked at as a personalized intervention. It can be tailored to the individual. We can also culturally tailor it. And so I view it as another tool for personalized approaches to work with this population. And so we'll see if that's the case.
Hi, interesting presentation. There I have two questions. One is that is the CYP enzyme inducible by the nicotine or some other medicine? That's the first question. And the second one is that the profile different between American Indian population and other Asians? Because the smoking rate is rather lower in Asian Pacific, but the AI is higher. It means, is this determined by this enzyme or not?
Yeah, so CYP2A6 is the primary nicotine metabolism enzyme. And so can you repeat your first question? Did that answer?
It means, yeah, if that is induced by the nicotine itself, the enzyme, higher enzyme may indicate simply they smoke more. Is that the case or not?
Yeah, that's what we think might be the case, that a faster or higher nicotine metabolism is contributing to the higher smoking. Oh,
Faster nicotine metabolism.
no, I think it's the other way around. So
if we drink more, we can, for example, induce the P450 to degrade alcohol more faster. It means if nicotine itself is inducing the enzyme, that translation becomes a little bit different. So
oh, yeah.
I just wonder.
Maybe I might bunt that to Sharon, who's.
It's not inducing?
Thank you.
And what about the difference between American Indian versus Asian Pacific Islanders?
Yeah, so I'm hopeful that our study will show some insights into that, whether that's the case, that there are differences between American Indians and other groups.
So that was a great presentation on how you built in various measures to make sure the community you wanted to study had bought into the research. So a question I have you talked, if this were federally funded, had you talked to the NIH if this is an appropriate data sharing and resource plan, if that's allowed with federal dollars, because we all have to check off that box that we built in the sharing and resource plan?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. NIH honors a more restricted data sharing agreement from tribes. And so I recently submitted this work as part of actually a K mechanism. And we included language in there that while the tribe does understand the need to share the results, it will be aggregate, and that they also want to recognize the need to protect their own tribal data. So, and NIH has been receptive to that.
And the biospecimens too? They're comfortable with the biospecimen management not being. We ran into a problem long ago with a biobank that was collected under NIH dollars, and the NIH claimed that their NCI claimed that they owned it, that they were responsible for its disposition.
Yeah, there's been actually a couple new funding announcements called the IRENA mechanism, Intervention Research to Improve Native American Health, and they built in that the understanding that tribes own that, the goal is that we want to be protecting the tribe and that we want them to participate in research, and so that there are safeguards that the NIH understand that will be put in place.
How many tribes are there in Minnesota, and are they homogeneous? Will all this data be a Minnesota tribe?
Yeah, no, there's about 11 to 12 tribes representing the Ojibwe as well as Dakotas. And so there are differences. That's one of the question is, what does, if we have one tribe looking at nicotine metabolism, does that confer an understanding of other tribes? And so that's why we're hoping to collaborate with other tribes and see the degree of heterogeneity.
Hi there. I'm interested in questions of power, and I think community-based participatory research brings in a lot of that. I think it's awesome what you're doing, validating the community members as research as well, like they're active members in the knowledge-making process. But I'm wondering how we can also make the scientific community recognize them as active members in the knowledge making process. Does that make me maybe look like for you, like having some community members that contributed a lot of intellectual knowledge and property as authors on the paper, for example? How can we bring these members like to the realm, to this academic realm that we're trying to involve them in, and not only look at them as, you know, they're being active
Right.
members, but still we have, I feel like, people in the scientific community who will only respect them as subjects and only bringing in a cultural knowledge that they don't respect as significant intellectual contribution, when it absolutely is in this situation.
Yeah, no, great point. I think it's really important, again, because of the equal partnership, to bring them in throughout the whole process, including the dissemination of the results. And so, indeed, we have some of the community members as authors on our abstracts and papers. Again, I think, I hope in the near future to have a joint presentation with the community members, as well as myself. And then I think providing opportunities for them to go to conferences and present on the results would be another avenue to do that. But I would love to talk to you more about ways to be able to bolster that, because I think again, it's a really important component.
Other questions or comments? All right, thank you, Dr. Carroll.
Yeah, thanks.